Welcome to a series of the Dissidents Podcast brought to you by the Black Institute for Liberal Values, founded in coordination with Free Black Thought. This week we're doing something a little bit different and speaking with Ada Akpala of the Equiano Project about her problem with the term Black excellence, which too often refers only to struggle instead of enterprise. In this way, it distances us from any universal experience, losing any constructive power. With a focus only and always on the past, we not only engage in, but also propagate a trauma economy and a political identity, which only indefinitely traps us into a victim narrative. We are caught in a loop of essentializing both race and history, with politicians and people using both as enticing power grabs, which diminishes our common humanity. This results in a generation of people who view self-accountability and sufficiency as the new N-word. They sell out stories of triumph and their own internal resiliency, playing an identity card to create a false sense of community and control. This podcast that we have called The Legacies of Black Pioneers. And we've decided to go live today because we are really, I think this is going to be a fascinating conversation with our guest, Ada Akpala from the Equiano Project. Sorry, I was going to say Center. Equiano Project, which Wink has recently started to write for. And Wink and I, as you may know, if you followed along, Winkfield Twyman Jr. and myself, we co-wrote a book, Letters in Black and White. And so a lot of the conversation we have has been around Black achievement, Black resilience, triumph, and trying to change this, oppressor-oppressed narrative or victimization narrative. So we had already planned, because Wink has been writing for the Equiano Project, to do a podcast with Ada. And we were kind of debating, what should we do this podcast on? And in the month of February, Wink put out a daily. And if you follow us on Circle, you'll see our daily under its Remember Us essay on a Black pioneering lawyer. And so I would repost those essays on Twitter. And one of the times I said, today we celebrate the Black excellence. I use the term Black excellence in reposting one of Wink's pioneering lawyers. And Wink immediately wrote me and said, oh, you've got to read Ada's piece on her problem with Black excellence, to which he sent to me. And immediately I said, this is what the podcast is going to be on. At the same time, Wink wrote to Ada and said, look, Jen just used the term Black excellence, and I have been doing these daily essays in the month of February for Black History Month on pioneering Black lawyers. Have we missed the mark? This was Wink's email to Ada and myself. So Ada, for our audience who may not have read your piece, which, by the way, it's linked into this invitation here on Circle, but give us the overview of your essay and your feelings around the term Black excellence.
Thank you, Jen. So yeah, it was very, just to clarify, first of all, my issue is not with Black excellence as a concept, as an idea, as a movement, if you want to call it. My issue is with the term itself. That's my issue with it. And it really all started when I was thinking about a lot of racialized terminologies and ideas and concepts. So it didn't really start with Black excellence itself. It started with other terms like the Black experience, right? We hear this a lot in discourse about race and inequality and so on. The Black experience. And then, of course, going back decades, we already had Black power and so on. So racialized terminology, racialized idea is not a new thing. But my issue is that it was re-embedding itself in society again. And instead of finding it actually quite empowering, I actually found it quite problematic in terms of the ideas that came from that. So, for example, just touching on the Black experience, every time I would hear this phrase used, in conversation or discussion, it was always with the aim of highlighting, struggle and pain and hardship. Right. So, for example, I was listening to a conversation, a very good conversation, actually, on BBC Radio. and it was with a gentleman called Simon Woolley, who is a distinguished figure in British society. He's accomplished a lot of things, even in the space of fighting for racial justice and so on. And as he was going through his personal narrative, talking about his upbringing, he was adopted by white parents, actually. He spoke about his experiences at school, his love of music, complications with, complicated feelings with his birth mother. And then he kind of summarized this as the Black experience. And I was thinking, well, hold on a second. What particularly is so unique about what you have explained there in terms of family hardship, bullying? Of course, we all have different ways that perhaps we've been bullied at school, but these general things, these universal things that every human being more or less has gone through, why is that summarized as the Black experience? And that's when I started to explore a lot of these other terms that are, taken for granted, right? Black excellence, Black love, Black pain, Black experience, like I've said, Black joy, right? Which was a theme, or at least a big idea in the Black History Month that just went in the US, if I'm not mistaken. And we've had that as a general theme here, I think in 2022 or 2021 in the Black History Month here as well. So I started to have a problem per se with those terms, not with the actual ideas or feelings or, concepts generated from those terms.
And so if I can jump in, Jen. So one of the things that really grabbed my attention when I read that, one of the things that called to me deeply was I could see both sides of the issue in rich detail. So for example, I think you're quite right to be to subject the term Black as a condition to universal themes like love and joy and excellence. I think that's really, I don't want to use the word problematic because I hear that too often in the public square, but I do think it's something which lends itself to question, because those are indeed human universals. And so in a way, it segregates, it separates and fences out people, humans, to experience those universal emotions just because of the accident of birth, just because of the accident of their ancestry. So I definitely get that, and I appreciate that. And as you probably know, I am a strong believer in, if there are 1.2 billion Black people on the planet, there are 1.2 billion life stories, experiences, and perspectives. So the label Black affixed to any emotion, it can't carry that load. That's too much of a burden. Now, having said that, I can see the other side in crystal clarity. So for example, I think that if you look at something like Black enterprise, let's use the word enterprise. When I was growing up, I grew up in an all Black world. And ironically, I didn't really think about race when I was in my all Black world. I suspect many people who grew up in Lagos, Nigeria, or Zimbabwe, or Ghana know the same feeling. It's like a fish in water. If everyone's Black, then you focus on things that are more particular to your human condition. However, when the schools desegregated in 1969, the fall, I went from being in an all Black world to the only Black kid in my class. And I'm sure, as sure can be, that many Nigerian immigrants to the UK know that feeling. I'm thinking of one woman, can't remember her name, who left Nigeria for Kent, England, and went from an all Black setting to being one of the few Blacks in her school in Kent. But my point is, as I went through school, I remember my uncle would leave issues of Black Enterprise magazine in the living room on the table. And I would just read Black Enterprise magazine as a 9-year-old or 10-year-old might, just because it was there to read. And I was curious. And I would learn about all of these people Berry Gordy, the founder of Motown, John Johnson, the founder of Ebony Magazine, Percy Sutton, the founder of Inter Broadcasting Corporation, Reginald Lewis, the purchaser of McCall's Pattern and Beatrice Company, Mr. Gaston, one of the largest Black hotel owners in Birmingham, Alabama. And I began to develop this sense that Blackness equaled enterprise. And so for me, affixing Blackness to enterprise wasn't simply about the pain and the hardship and the struggle and the oppression, crawling through the muck, to kind of paraphrase your response on Patience's podcast. You didn't use the word muck, but I got the point. The idea is that in my mind as a little kid, Blackness became synonymous with enterprise. So Black Enterprise magazine for me, as the only Black kid in my class, infused me with an aspirational way of understanding Blackness. And I think that was a constructive, positive good that Patience would appreciate. And I suspect you do too. So thread that needle for me, Ada. It can be bad to have Black as a conditioner, but it can be a tremendous good too. How do you square those two experiences that I had?
Yeah, so I don't disagree with anything that you've said. And, you know, as I mentioned, I want to make it very clear that I don't have an issue at all with the concept. But as it is today, we have to question, is it still really relevant, right? I mean, the term, as you mentioned, you know, Blackness meant something constructive, right? Something positive. And, you know, you don't, people like yourself, I presume, I don't want to be presumptuous, but, you know, you don't ascribe victimhood and pain and, you know, struggle to Blackness, right?
No, never taught that. Never taught that.
Exactly.
That's alien to me.
For me, that's just an indirect way to stay in those situations, right? It's very problematic when you try to pretend that actually these things are to empower your people or you know, to move your people forward, but then the main focus, the primary focus, remains on the past, remains on what didn't happen to you. For example, during the Reconstruction era and Jim Crow, that was a good time to emphasize Black excellence, right? Because there was that legal and social segregation, right?
So there's hope for pioneer Black lawyers.
Exactly. It wasn't indirect. It wasn't, you know, subtle. It was obvious. It was baked into society. You know, in the 50s here, when you had the Windrush generation, or the pioneers, as some people like to call them, they were actually directly and explicitly, you know, excluded from renting. They were excluded from, you know, getting loans, you know, having that financial support. So what did they do? They bought houses. What did they do? They started their own financial funds. That for me is Black excellence. That for me is, I'm not excusing what happened. And I think it's wrong. And as you've seen, we're always fighting, you know, to change and understand, you know, better ways of doing things to create that cohesion in society. But they took advantage of that situation to be excellent, to be great. And then you have now in 2024, where there are no legal barriers, you know, to success, right? Yes, you may have here and there certain issues that still need to be ironed out. But, you know, for example, here in the UK, certain demographics are outpassing the white groups. Not that I always want whites to be the standard anyway, but that seems to be the standard of what people use to measure, right, individual or group success. So I don't think that explicit racialized concept is needed anymore, unless it retains that constructive, positive idea. But as you notice, in mainstream discourse, it doesn't. And like I've said before, it's very interesting. If you look for definitions of Black excellence, you will have one part that says, yes, obviously, it's the celebration of the ability and the achievements of Black people, right? And then what's the other part? because of the racist system, you know, and the institutional barriers and everything that they have to crawl through. That for
Don't
me,
forget slavery.
slavery that happened, you know, 400 years ago and has happened throughout humanity. So there's more of a focus on that. There's more of a focus on certain kinds of people as well. I'm glad that you studied the Black lawyers and so on. But if you look at in the mainstream, it's certain kinds of people with certain specific, you know, ideologies and political viewpoints that seem to always be propagated, right, as the, you know, the main example of Black excellence. So I think that's my issue again with these things.
You're speaking to the choir. You're speaking to the choir in a sense. You know, one of the things that so moved me, I was preparing for our wonderful chat this morning, and I remembered an old book that was written by Scott Davis. He's a writer who has spent time in Richmond, Virginia, the city of my birth in the U.S. And what he had done was he had analyzed this Black neighborhood called Fulton in the city of Richmond. And it was an interesting study because he looked through 4 or 5 generations, if not 6 generations, of Black Americans in this neighborhood from slavery to the 1970s. And what did he find? He found that at the end of slavery, when the Ku Klux Klan and terrorist groups and ex-slave owners were on the rampage against freedmen, he found that the people who had known the worst of times found the inner mental resources to make a better way for themselves. They were almost the progenitors of the Windrush generation in the UK. And so he wrote about that, how these were some of the most proud, resilient, ambitious, enterprising people you could have imagined throughout the 10s, 20s, 30s, and 40s in Fulton. But then it's so funny. It was not funny, it's actually quite sad. He writes about what changed. What changed to dissolve the strong spirit of the children and grandchildren of slaves in Fulton and Richmond, Virginia. And I'm just going to quickly quote what he says. He says that the problem was essentially outside influences of urban renewal and anti-poverty programs. And I quote, "Yet these federal efforts carried with them concepts from the wider culture that portrayed individuals as victims. A notion did not sit right with people like Patience, irony, Patience Grooms, who had spent their whole lifetime exercising self-sufficiency. Patience and her contemporaries, they tried to deflect those intrusions from the outside world that tried to bring those ideas to bear in their neighborhood. But the power of the outside influences was too strong, and Fulton was no longer a sign of self-sufficiency and self-reliance and enterprise. It became another garden variety ghetto neighborhood. And to me, that's so striking, that a people whose grandparents and great-grandparents knew the very heights of self-reliance and self-sufficiency would be compromised by these do-good attitudes from the outside world in the 1960s and the 1970s. Do you ever comment upon that?
Yeah, I think partly to do with this trauma economy we have nowadays, where everyone really finds that validation and that, you know, through victimhood and through trauma. It's so funny, or not funny, but it's interesting for trauma. You know, scientifically, you don't really retain full memories of what actually happened that caused you to be traumatic. What you retain is those emotions, you know, that physiological aspect. And I just find it interesting that those who are centuries and decades removed from said traumatic events can have such strong reactions or strong feelings. So you have to, it's one of two things. The first one is that, you know, sadly, parents and grandparents and aunties, you know, pass on these, feelings and stories from generation to generation. And another part is people, with all due respect, they make it up, right? They make up this hardship and this pain, and because it's comforting, is a way out, is a way to excuse yourself from actually looking at your life. And I'm not just talking about this individually, I mean this collectively as well. It's very interesting when you look within the Black demographic group and you see the differences, for example, with, Caribbeans and Africans, and the dynamic is a tiny bit different in the US, I think, but here, because the Caribbeans had a different history in terms of, that direct racism in the UK and stuff. If you see that the difference between Africans and Caribbeans, and you see, the difference in socioeconomic status, income, wealth, and so on, and then you have to wonder, why is that? Perhaps one group isn't clinging on to narratives. Though, yes, living in this country, of course, we may have faced, exclusion, we may have faced ostracization and so on. But some groups don't have that baked into their cultural mindset and that cultural value. So that doesn't mean, snubbing the other group or saying, just snap out of it. But that does mean that perhaps other groups who feel that they're stuck in these cycles, take a page out of those who aren't, right? And because something is working that they're doing, right, to excel in education, to excel in income and so on. So, yeah, I forgot my train of thought and your specific question, but I just really wanted to touch on this idea of, holding on to that pain of certain events.
So if we're going to take this to today, I mean, I think you've touched on this already, but the problem I see is that a lot of people are holding on to this narrative and these certain events. And Wink and I, kind of go back and forth on this a bit in our book, and it's around this idea that he hates this idea, and I feel like you two are simpatico with this, and I'm actually in agreement myself. But there's a lot of people buy into this idea of like post-traumatic slave syndrome, right? And I agree that this is a narrative that is holding people back. But here's the thing: where do we go from here? How do we change the narrative? How do we change the script? So let me give you two examples of stuff that we're trying to do. I mean, actually several. One is by, Wink doing his pioneering lawyers. Instead of talking about, slavery all the time and oppression all the time, let's talk about people who have done amazing things. And like you said, in a time where they had everything against them, actually, found this resilience and this strength of spirit. But then the other thing that we're doing is, so for example, we do a lot of work with Free Black Thought. And with Free Black Thought, the Institute for Liberal Values has started the Black Institute for Liberal Values. And we've had a lot of internal discussions around this. A lot of people saying, why do we need the adjective Black? Aren't you just recreating this separation? And half of me agrees. But the other part of me, and this is something that Eric Smith and I talk about with his starting up, co-founding Free Black Thought, is yes, and we're at a moment in time, though, where we have to meet people where they're at. And so to do so, we have to, and again, I have problems around this idea of Black community. Black, I don't know what that even means, a Black experience. But to the extent that some people feel that there is a Black experience and that there is a Black community and there's some definition around Blackness, we're trying to enter into that space with a new narrative, if you will, one of resilience, one of triumph, one that dismisses post-traumatic slave syndrome. So I would love to get your feedback on that, because again, we've had, and Wink even, who, contributes in a lot to, with his pioneers to the Black Institute of Liberal Values, had absolutely was like, why do we need to put Black on this? But it's like, if we want people to, who do value Blackness to actually read it, we need to meet them there with that adjective, if you will. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, have we missed the boat? Is there another way to do it that we've missed? What do you think?
I don't think so. So again, even though I say I have a problem with Black excellence and Black experience, I don't deny that they exist or that they even need to exist. But I have a problem with the way that we navigate them at the moment, right? I do have a problem with this term, this racial marker anyway, called blackness and whiteness. I think that they're very useless, in my opinion, and they're very divisive. And, you know, we all know how these were birthed in the first place. It wasn't natural creations. It was birthed for specific, you know, political reasons and for exploitation, so on. So, and also, you know, it's very, you know, no one can make up their mind who is black and who's white as well. You know, so when having these concrete ideas, you know, concrete theories based on things that people can't really make their minds up anyway. However, it's here. This is what we have. This is how we used to understand ourselves, each other, history, and so on. So to say that, you know, no one should use black or white, you know, I'm definitely not there. I know that people are pushing for things like, you know, color blindness, which I agree with, or racelessness, which, you know, I find very noble, and I really hope to God we get there, because that is the place where true humanity can thrive. However, at the moment, this is how we understand. This is how we relate, right? This is how, more importantly, we can reach those who perhaps, you know, are stuck in that ideological cocoon. So that's why I'm very specific, you know, because people say that to me as well. You know, why do you say, even though you're criticizing it, why are you using these specific words like white and black? But because I don't want to speak in abstraction. White and black is abstract itself. If I make it more abstract, you know, I'm not going to reach people where they are. So I'm for it. I'm for using these words. I absolutely adore Free Black Thought. Every time I say their name, I feel a little bit of me just free and taking a fresh air, and that's me. So imagine those who feel like they can't express themselves because of, you know, ideological conformity and so on. So
I wanted to add a quick point. Ada, so as you know, I'm a strong believer in, if there are 200 million Black people in the UK, there are 200 million life stories, experiences, and perspectives. I'll take that narrative framework to the grave. So have you said that?
Definitely not 200 million. But yeah.
No, 2 million, 2 million. Thank you, 2 million. Would it be the case if there were 200, right? Yeah. But we're talking about this notion that unfortunately Blackness carries with it these negative connotations or implications. I want to take you in time, Ada, to a cafe, a restaurant in Berlin, and there are two people talking to each other. To the outside world, and when they were both youngsters, they would both have presented as Black Americans. But on this day at this cafe, one does not, and eventually the other does not as well. It is truly what I think is a transcendent moment in racial psychology. And here's the cafe moment. You have at the restaurant none other than Thomas Chatterton Williams, who you are aware of. And then you have Adrian Piper, who you may be aware of as well. She's a Black artist from Berlin. And Thomas Chatterton Williams has a daughter. He has a daughter who looks as Nordic can be. Blonde, blue eyes, pale skin, all the rest, lives in France. And so Thomas Chatterton Williams is wondering about and feels guilty about this idea of losing Blackness, not just for his daughter, but for himself. He's married a white French lady. And he's half Black himself, half white. And then he says, you know what it is, Adrian? It's not just that one drop of Black blood makes you Black. I think it's more that I feel a sense of debt, indebtedness to past suffering. That guilt, Black guilt. And we always hear the word white guilt, but never Black guilt. But Thomas says, that's really Blackness. And Adrian says to Thomas Chatterton Williams, because she's already retired from Blackness, as I have. She says to Thomas, why would you want that in the first place? If that pain and guilt isn't in your daughter, why introduce it? And I thought that was so wise, that we have the power to be who we are. And that can be in race or outside of race or in or outside of race or retired from race. To me, Ada, that is a more powerful way to be in the world than to feel one has to conform or appease the dogmatist, those who define Blackness in a certain way. What are your thoughts about that?
Exactly. And what do we usually hear, right? It's unfair that white people never have to think about their race. And I'm thinking, well, I hope that we can get there one day ourselves. And it's one thing to say, oh, well, we're always reminded. I don't know how much of that is true and how much is that all with of us actually clinging to that and constantly reminding ourselves, in every moment that we can. And again, with that reminder is that association of pain and guilt, like you said. And also, the problem with Black, unfortunately, is that it's a very political identity. It's a politicized identity. Just to give you a very simple example, I have a friend who's going to have a baby soon, and she's Black, she's African. And so, I'm just helping her out, anything that she needs. And I was just Googling a few days ago, tips for Black women, giving birth, for example. And everything was about racism. Everything. The headlines, guys, the headlines. If I was a mother or a mother-to-be, the headlines itself is enough to induce that stress in me that will probably have detrimental impact in the long run, right? We don't talk about that. We like to talk about mortality, and we should, but we don't talk about these kind of narratives that seep in indirectly, right, to the mothers. But that's a whole nother conversation itself. But the point I'm trying to make, every headline, this is why Black women die, so on and so forth. And I said to my husband, how is this actually going to help a woman that's looking to have a baby? I'm looking for tips. I just typed tips. And you know what he said? He said, type in African. And I wrote tips for African women giving birth. Completely different.
Oh, how was it different?
It didn't have that. I actually had some tips. Now, I'm not going to some headlines that were the same, but it was completely different. I couldn't find one page that gave me tips when I searched Black, but I found here and there a few tips, when I wrote African. So can you see, this is what I'm trying to say. It's a politicized identity, unfortunately. And that's why when people cling to it, it can be quite dangerous and it can be quite damaging. It's not freeing in any way, whether you willingly, ascribe to your Blackness or unwillingly. It's a label that traps us, in my opinion, and from my experience and from the experience of many people I know. It can be subtle things, or it can just be, greater things like ideological things. And that's why you see, unfortunately, that it is easy sometimes to manipulate, the so-called Black community in certain things. Once you have that Black emotionalism, attached to an idea or movement, that's money for whoever's, behind that, right? We've seen this so many times. I'm not saying anything new with BLM. Anything that you want to push, right? Sorry, other quick examples. I see it here all the time. When a politician is struggling to get an idea perhaps accepted by, the masses, what happens? Oh, this is why this is racist, and this is why you should agree to it or not agree. So can you see that there is actually that indirect power in Blackness, politically, socially, even though we try to pretend otherwise, right? So it's a complicated, complex, fascinating thing, this idea of Blackness. But I definitely think we have to be careful.
So why do you and I resist? Why do you and I fight the dogma? Why do you and I non-conform? I mean, I love it. I mean, I once read that people who have the same vibes are of the same tribe. So I think you and I are the same tribe in that sense. But why do you think we resist? Why do we see behind the veil? What is it about you and I?
Wink, I love this question. I want to stay on for just a second because we've got a question from the audience that was
Oh, sure, no
regarding
problem.
that. So the question from the audience is why did you ask either Black or African in your question as opposed to just a woman giving birth?
Because there is that statistical difference, right? And this is with anything. There are these statistical differences. And also I was searching because I already knew where I was going and what I was looking for, right? Living in the UK with dark skin, naturally, you will have lower levels of vitamin D if you're not taking supplements, right? This is biology and so on. So there are different things that perhaps may assist a Black woman, right? Especially because of the higher levels of melanin and so on. They're not greater differences, but it can, be crucial when it comes to, giving birth and so on. So yes, of course, I definitely looked at the general tips, but perhaps there was something different, for Black women. Not that I believe that we're different race and so on, but different geographical origins, they make a difference. So it wasn't a racial thing, it was more a knowledge thing of if there's anything that was different that perhaps she needed to do, which there really wasn't, apart from that vitamin D side. And also we have Black women are tend to have high levels of obesity, so perhaps there's learning about that, knowledge about that, and I think the more education around things like that, as opposed to racism, and I know those things are somehow uncomfortable, right? Especially when you have dieting is white supremacist and racist and so on, but these things are what are crucial when it comes to health differences and health disparities. So yeah, that's why I looked it up. Great question.
Yeah.
So Wink, back to you.
Yeah. What is it? What's the secret sauce, Ada?
I don't want to say luck because that's a silly answer. But I feel lucky. I always say I'm so grateful. And I've always, thought like this. But I do think it's just experience, maybe. My reason to why I think like this, I can guarantee is different to why you think the way you are, the way you do, sorry. I was born in Nigeria, and like you said, fish in water, everyone's Black. We don't describe ourselves as the Black girl. We just say the tall girl, the pretty girl, the son of this person, the daughter of that person. That is, no matter where I go in the world, that's what shaped me. That's how I, understood. That was my perspective. And then coming into England as an African girl, I face a lot of issues, yes, in terms of racism and being different in that way, but I also face a lot of issues as well from the so-called Black community, and that created a kind of identity crisis, which was, in hindsight, the best thing that could ever happen to me in terms of my outlook today, because that allowed me to step all the way back and say, whoa, if, this group is the one that's meant to be my downfall and the reason if I have low self-esteem, then why is this group that looks like me actually a bigger reason for that? So I didn't, take into these race ideologies and things like that. I just said, look, that group is filled with individual humans and this group is filled with individual humans. I didn't say that group is like this, because they were all the same. Right. And that's, I think, the key to answer your question very simply. For you not to think in that racialized bubble, you have to deracialize your thinking. You have to deracialize your worldview. I always say, when I saw George Floyd, being knelt on by, I forgot his name. Yes. Yeah. I didn't see a white cop and a Black man. I saw two human beings, one abusing his power, one perhaps in the wrong place at the wrong time. That's how I approach life. And that's how I have always approached life, because that's what life has taught me. I didn't grow up thinking this group is doing this to me because they have white skin. And so, does that make sense? So
it does.
For you not to have that, clinging to certain groups and certain communities, so to say. You have to approach people on a human level, recognizing the good and evil in you, recognizing the good and evil in others, but not essentializing that. Knowing history totally, and not essentializing history, right? And I think that's just the easiest way for you not to be stuck in that. And it's so freeing, right? Doesn't mean you don't have culture. Doesn't mean you don't love your culture. Doesn't mean you don't have your heroes. But you find the humanity in people. That's all.
Yeah. So that we Wink and I have had several conversations with our friend Sheena Mason, who talks about the theory of racelessness, and so part of my question is around, do you think that this is even possible? You kind of touched on racelessness at the very beginning of this conversation. One of the things, asking the same question to our friend Angel Eduardo, his thing is not colorblind but color blah. Right. And I love that, it's like, I see that, because honestly, being in a place like America or the UK, where I could call you the tall woman, or I could call, you Wink, the guy in the black shirt, but it's easy to say that's the white girl over there, or, the black guy over there, really just as a descriptor, as, when you're trying to find someone in a crowd, right? It has no other connotation except for like, you're tall, you're black, you're whatever, you're short. So instead of like going raceless, where you wouldn't even use those terms would be like, just taboo, they're color blah. So Angel would say color blah, where it's like, okay, I'm saying the black girl over there, but it has nothing to do. It's only because that's a descriptor, and you're in a crowd, and it's easy to point you out that way. What do you think about? So I guess there's several questions in there, but what do you think about the idea of racelessness? Is it a possibility? Or do you what do you think about being color blah? It sounds like you're into the color blah, but is there a way that we could ever get to racelessness?
No, I don't think so. I think it's just too baked into our social culture. So it's like getting rid of money almost. It's like money is a social construction. It's not natural. It's how we use to trade and stuff, but it exists. It's reality. It's here to stay. It may transform. We may use different forms of money in the future, digitalized and so on, but it's still going to be a way that we trade and so on. And I think that's the same with the race. I don't think we can get rid of, the idea of race, but I think, yes, we can navigate it in different ways. Color blindness, and sorry, what did he say? Color blah.
Yeah.
Blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, like just blah, like right. I don't care, blah.
Right.
Exactly. I definitely think we can get to there, and that does mean, removing these racialized ideas, like this is a black thing or a black space, or these things that we're seeing crop up, again in society, segregationist, spaces and theater, like you wrote about, Wink, entertainment and
right.
Why, I think we were making that progress, but unfortunately, this so-called racial consciousness that happened in 2020 has just taken us all the way back, right? So that is definitely, that's the aim.
Ada, I'm going to play devil's advocate because I love it and I'm curious. So I'm a little bit of pushback. Here you go. So when you look at me, what do you see?
A man.
Anything else?
A black
Anything
man.
else?
A black
Anything
man.
else? That's it. Is that it? Basically, a black man?
A friendly-looking black man.
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate compliment. Now, what's interesting for those who are here, what's fascinating to me is that Ada's made a wonderful case for how racelessness is not within the realm of possibility. And I think there's a lot of weight to that argument. But notice I asked my friend Ada to tell me who she saw. And she said a friendly black man. Well, in fact, I'm much more than that. Did you know that I am, as you look at me, Igbo? I am, as you look at me, Fulani. I am as you look at me, Hassan. I am as you look at me, Bamun, Bamoun. Those are all different tribes from Nigeria. And back in Nigeria, they probably don't get along sometimes, I suspect. But my point being, those are part of who I am, but to your naked eye, you didn't see those parts of me. Couldn't we reach a place one day where you could be Black and white and Hispanic and Native American and Chinese and all the rest, but you wouldn't see those parts of a person? You would just see a tanned, olive-skinned person of indeterminate ancestry. I guess that's my point.
Yeah, I think so. But, as human beings, we like to simplify things. And that's why I don't actually mind these terms of black and white. I think some people want to get rid of these terms because they feel things are automatically, maybe not automatically, I shouldn't insult people's intelligence, but, they think things will improve, or it's definitely a path for that social cohesion, or at least to remove that tribalism. And so I completely disagree. You already touched on it, right? If you take away race, it's going to be religion again. If you take away religion, it's going to be, we all remember the Parsley massacre, that people were massacred for how the accent of how they said the word parsley, and that's how they divided who was who, right? Just from your intonation and your accent. We've heard times that people were massacred because, they wore glasses, and that was a sign of intelligence, and that was a bad thing. So yes, I don't have a problem with these terms in relation to that, because I think that's very naive. And unfortunately, humans find very creative ways to be tribal and, and to go from there. And I also think it's quite complicated for us, right, to not have that initial way of, describing someone, and then we're having to think, okay, they are from this part of, so that's why black, white, brown, that they say now, it works for us. And again, as a descriptor, what is the issue? Right. There is no issue. Right. You've got a black shirt, you've got blonde hair, I can see, I have absolutely no connotations, at face value, connected to that. But when you have things, connected to race, that is the only issue. There's no other issue apart from that, right? Whether positive or negative, things that people ascribe to racial groups and racial categories. I know sometimes, we talk about disparities and we compare, Africans and Caribbeans and so on. That's just to paint a picture, but that's not to essentialize. Paint a picture in terms of noticing a difference and seeing, okay, what could be going on there? But that's not to say, okay, because this group, has this baked into their DNA and stuff. We've gone past this kind of pseudoscientific ideas. We can talk about culture. I definitely believe that, right? We can talk about differences in perhaps habits, traditions. That's a more interesting conversation, but definitely making it racial, I think, gets us nowhere.
Yeah. And to be fair, those groups I mentioned aren't races, they're tribes. And in the Black American experience, as you know, in the 1600s, 1700s, and 1800s, because of plantation conditions and slavery, all of those different groups were just forcibly bred together, bound together. So you really created a new, if you will, phenotype of Blackness on the planet. It was the Black American, because no Black American is 100% Black. We're all some variation of people, be it European or Native American or whatever. But I wanted to make this comment as well. And one of the things which really tugs at my heartstrings in terms of Blackness and the limited definition of Blackness, the dogma of Blackness, is how it limits the mindset of those who are most privileged and Black. I know people who are more privileged than, let's say, 99% of the world's population, and they will tell you Blackness is oppression, nothing else matters. Go figure. I know someone who is at an elite institution in America, and this person, Jen remembers the person, had a very integrated, affluent lifestyle growing up, But when she came to college, she discovered the Black dorm, her Blackness. And now she views Blackness as solidarity. Solidarity equals Blackness. Blackness equals solidarity. Are we looking at a generation of lost, privileged Black Americans, Ada? What do you think?
Yes, sadly, and that's
yes, sadly.
yeah, not just Black Americans, by the way, and that's the biggest problem with this idea of Blackness as a whole and linking it to struggle and oppression. And funnily enough, I'm not the only person that has a problem with the term Black excellence. Actually, a lot of people who believe in this so-called victim narrative and insurmountable barriers against them also have a problem with Black excellence, because now what Black excellence means to them is this measuring up to whiteness and sucking up to capitalism, shall we say, right? So it's gone full circle. We can never be okay. It's like we found that we were getting somewhere. Excellence was being exuded from our community, so to speak, and then are we? It's like we're not happy with that progress. I'm speaking, in abstract forms, but it's like, and then we've now brought it back again. Actually, we don't want Black excellence because we can't breathe, or why is Black excellence just being, the best? People have said that. Why can't it just mean being being alive? I've heard.
That's a high standard. That's a high bar.
Right? Just existing, right? So it's like why are we so uncomfortable with the excellence that we claim to be about? Why are we so uncomfortable with being great? Really being great? Why does greatness why can't it be unconditional in terms of, why is always that caveat? Yes, we're great, but actually look at all the people who aren't allowed to be great because of the racist system, or look at what we had to crawl through and go through in this anti-Black world, not knowing that everyone to get to that excellence and that greatness probably has a story to tell, right? So it's very, very, very frustrating that there's a sub-demographic group of Black people that just can't be comfortable. Obviously, there's a psychological thing as well, maybe. Let's play the devil's advocate, right? We can say, yes, the legacy of slavery and being in that trauma response and that, struggle and so on. It kind of, I'm sure you've met people, maybe they've, struggled their whole life personally, and they have that kind of imposter syndrome. They can't believe where they are today. I don't know. I don't have the answers, but I know that there's something definitely there where, that greatness comes, but there's always a but this happened. It's never, only some people, right? They call them coons, they call them conservatives, they call them, white adjacent and things like that. It can't just be actually, yes, this is the rule. These are the rules we have to play by, right? In terms of, I'm saying that to say that sometimes they think, well, why do we have to do it this way, right? This system wasn't built for us. This is a different system, not knowing that everyone pretty much has to follow similar paths, right? You work hard, you grind, you shut out outside distractions. Sometimes you have to go it alone. That's not just a Black thing. You get a lot of rejections, sometimes hundreds, right? That's not just a Black thing. Unfortunately, that's how life can be.
It's a life thing.
More Africans, because I do think if you live in Nigeria or Zimbabwe or another country, you have a different perspective on these things, that these crypt ideas of Blackness feel unnatural. They feel suffocating in a sense. There are two ways it can go. Will more Nigerian immigrants to the UK and the US save us from dogma? Or will the children and grandchildren of the classical Nigerian immigrant doctor in the US become acculturated into this dogmatic culture? Which way do you think the future lies? I want to hear your thoughts.
I think it will be both. And I love this question. And I've thought about it a little bit, but not a lot. But I think it definitely, it definitely will be both. The influence from so-called Africans will be, those that perhaps it's, maybe they have a very strong support, a network around them like I do. So, for example, I can't ever say that I'm not privileged because, I feel that that's a disservice to what my family is and what they've done and what they actually have today. Thankfully, everything's great. We do what we want. Things are good. So for me to say I'm oppressed, it feels like I'm insulting my own family story.
Yeah,
that's more important to me. My loyalty is to my family story and what I've seen them do and achieve, rather to some ideological thing. However, like going back to what I was saying before, it is nice though, isn't it? It is comfortable to kind of find an excuse of why perhaps things may not go well for you. So a lot of Africans, they've not had that, because in our countries, there's no excuse. There's no aid. There's no welfare. There's no, and I'm talking generally, I'm not talking about a specific policy. I'm just, if you don't have, you don't eat. If you don't eat, you're done for. It's as simple as that. And then we come here and there's all these, cushions. There's all these safety nets. Oh, you're down on your luck. Oh, there's this to help you. Oh, you didn't get that? Well, you have your skin color. You can use that. You can use that card, as they say. We can't do that in our country.
You can't do that in Lagos.
No, they will laugh at you, to say the least. Well, and I'm saying that because there is a thing of woke Africans, so to speak.
Oh, right.
And they're kind of finding, actually, we owed something, because by virtue of being Black, and they think the victimhood idea is so temptingly, dangerous. It's so alluring. Who wouldn't want to have an excuse or, a reason why they can't do or get? It's so comfortable, right? Unfortunately. And that's why we have this victimhood culture, not even just in terms of race, but in everything else that we're seeing nowadays. Watching a show called The Apprentice. The Apprentice, right?
Yes.
And a girl, she was a young girl, 20 something. So she's Gen Z. I think she's even younger. And she chose to go in the show. And I see this a lot. And the whole thing was, well, why didn't the show support her? And where was the help? And it's like, back in our time, it's like, you chose to go in it. So, get your grit on and, do what you have to do. And nowadays, it's all about what can be done for me, even though it's my choice and my decision, something I've chosen to do. But how can you accommodate me? How can you help me? And there's nothing wrong with help. But again, someone mentioned self-sufficiency. That has gone out the window. That's almost taboo, right? We saw it recently on Twitter. Someone saying that self-accountability is the new N-word. So when you have language and talk like this, of course, it's going to be like, oh, is it? Okay. So I don't have to be self-accountable. Self-accountable and responsibility is whiteness. Well, I don't want to play into that whiteness and supremacy and so on. So let's relax and take a step back. So it's going to be both, I think. It's interesting to play out. I want to see how it will play out in the next couple of years.
I think we've got so much more to talk about, Ada, and you'd mentioned that maybe you'll come on again. So I hope that you do, because I feel like we just scratched the surface, but we promised you an hour, and I want to end with one of the questions from our audience for you. So the question is, in your podcast, Challenge the Narrative, which this member loved, you offered alternative narratives and encouraged people to consider context. Did you get feedback from people saying that you had inspired a person to reinterpret their experience?
Yes, definitely. And I think that's the part that warms my heart a bit, because this can be, maybe not so much now, but it can sometimes be a lonely walk in terms of, you are going against the current and you're going against the mainstream. I mean, you guys know very well, the dissidents, so to speak, right? Going against so-called controversial views, which is so ridiculous because these things shouldn't be controversial, right? But yeah, definitely, I have had feedback from people just saying that it was, you know, a breath of fresh air. I think that's the one that makes me smile the most, because I know how I felt before, you know, coming out publicly and sharing my opinions, and always thinking I was weird or I was crazy or that there was something wrong with me, or was I really Black? Was I really human then? And all these things. And you just realize that actually you are perfectly normal and you are very, very human. And, you know, and it's amazing when I get those when people reach out to me saying that. So yeah.
Thank you. And I do hope we will reach out again to see when we might be able to schedule part 2 of this. It's been such a pleasure having you on. Thank you for your time.
It's been great. It's been wonderful.
Yeah. And we hope you feel better.
Yes. Good health. Good health.
Thank you.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Take care.